we have reached the advertised start time for this webinar, so we shall get started. Firstly, a huge welcome to everyone who has tuned in live to watch and take part. My name is Phil Underwood. I'm the marketing executive from the Society for the Environment. My details are on your screen for any questions that you have following the webinar. As always, and rightly so, I have the easy job of introducing the webinar. Then we'll hand over to our two expert speakers before going straight into a question and answer session to conclude. If you're watching this webinar as a recording, if you do have any questions, then please feel free to contact me using the details on the screen. This is the format for today's webinar. So I'll shortly be handing over to our first speaker, Mandhy, to start off proceedings, before handing over to Jonathan, and I'll introduce each speaker in a bit more detail before their talks. We'll then conclude with the Q&A session. So first off, a little bit about the Society for the Environment, very briefly. The Society for the Environment holds a Royal Charter, which was awarded in 2004. We are the custodian of two professional registrations, the Chartered Environmentalist, or CEnv Register, and the Registered Environmental Technician, or REnv Tech Register. We're an umbrella organisation, so we license professional bodies to award these professional registrations. Currently, we have 25 professional bodies as constituent bodies. All of these bodies on your screen at the moment offer the Chartered Environmentalist registration to their members. 3 of these also offer the Registered Environmental Technician Register, and they are highlighted on your screen at the moment. So that's enough about the Society for the Environment. We're going to get into the webinar itself. So this webinar is around waste reduction. This is the very first of our expert-led series of webinars. These new series will provide perspectives from across our constituent bodies to increase knowledge transfer for our registrants and beyond. The series is based around the topic of waste reduction, and the final webinar in this series, there's 3 webinars, will take place exactly 6 months since World Environment Day 2018. The series, like I say, is made up of 3 webinars. There are 2 speakers within each webinar, so we have 6 expert speakers throughout this series. Now, plastic waste is something that's hit the headlines recently, but we will be covering other forms of waste that are also causing damage and concerns at the moment. So, our first speaker is Mandhy. I apologise to Mandhy. I won't try and pronounce her surname, but I'm sure she will. Mandhy is a Chartered Environmentalist via the Institute of Water and is Director of Fyrefly Global Solutions, as well as a member of CEnv. She's also heavily involved in the Institute of Water through various activities and projects. Mandhy will be providing her insight into the world of plastic with the question, why should we care? So, Mandhy, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fab. Thanks, Phil. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining in. We know you may have a lot of other things to do over lunchtime, so we'll try and keep this entertaining and informative. So, Phil gave me the challenge of plastics. Why should we care? And I took it very seriously. It did start off as a technical presentation on the water industry. However, it turned out that the water industry will not be reducing its use of plastic, because for most of you that may work in the industry know that actually MDP plastics is probably our best choice in terms of pipe installations. So it took a little bit more of a personal journey. So let me start. There we go. Okay, so World Environment Day, June 5th, 2018. Their theme was, if you can't reuse it, refuse it, and everybody got onto the bandwagon, including celebrities. That's William Shatner over there, trying to reduce his plastic use. Not to be outdone, Institute of Water also held their own World Environment Day event with our own raft of celebrities. That's Ian Limb, Portsmouth Water HR Director, playing a judge against ZTech and Southeast Water, trying to convince them to use less plastic. We had Sky News doing a whole raft of programs, really good. Have a watch of it, very informative. We had this campaign called Switch the Stick to reduce the use of plastic in cotton buds. And quite a lot of the UK supermarkets have signed up to this. And one of the best things to come out of it was a reduction in your coffee prices. So most of the big chains decided to give you money back. And in terms of impact, maybe something for you to decide on. So the supermarkets went on to charging 5 pence for a plastic bag, which means the supermarkets now made millions more on something that they had to give away for free before, and it's still a plastic bag. Perhaps less contentious and more effective was David Attenborough's Blue Planet series, the second one, which made a huge difference, which really pushed this campaign. And my personal favorite is this. So, EU will ban the approve of single-use plastics. The only problem is we are not sure whether after Brexit, the UK will remain and follow these rules. But that's okay, guys. We have our waste hierarchy: reduce, reuse, recycled. Even if plastic isn't banned, we all recycle, right? Or is it? So just to give you a very quick plastic theme, in the style of a pub quiz, how many tons of fishing gear ends up in the sea annually? 1 million tons. What was humanity's plastic consumption in 2008? A whopping 260 million tons. How much of the plastic we use is single use? 50%. How many recyclable coffee cups are thrown away in the UK annually? 2.5 billion. And so they are recyclable. So how many of these actually get recycled? 1 in 400. How much plastic does it take to diaper a baby? 143 kilograms of plastic. How many tampons get washed up on the ocean annually? Almost 30,000. How many throwaway bottles does Coca-Cola produce every year? 100 billion, according to Greenpeace. Plastic bottled water, how many are bought around the world every single minute? 1 million. And they did a little bit more research into it, and particularly in Asia, the problem is getting worse, and it is because of, and I quote, insatiable desire for bottled water and the spread of a Western urbanized on-the-go culture in the China and Asia-Pacific region. So percentage of plastic bottles that are apparently recycled, 50%. Percentage of plastic bottles recycled into new bottles, 7%. So the rest, the percentage of plastic bottles in landfill and ocean, couldn't get any actual facts, but having watched all of the program, I think the rest end up in the ocean. What is a microplastic? It has been defined as anything that is less than 1 millimeter in width. Common sources of microplastics: toothpaste, face wash, clothing, tires, plastic bags, and apparently most of what we seem to use in modern life. How many plastic bags are used globally? 1 trillion plastic bags. That's 12 zeros. How many barrels of oil is that? So how much oil do we need to create plastic bags? 100 million barrels of oil, considering it's a finite resource. And lastly, how many pieces of plastic are in the ocean? 5.25 trillion. And how much of the world's plastic is actually recycled? Remember, we are all very, very savvy recyclers. Only 9 to 11% of all of the world's plastic are recycled. So moving on, I'm not sure whether reduce, reuse, recycle, the possibilities are endless. To be honest, guys, I think the possibilities have ended, and I think we need to move on to the resource efficiency hierarchy. Have a quick look. I won't go through the whole thing, but if you look at the top, it's actually about removing plastic entirely from the equation and moving on to using items with less plastic and reusing. Recycle, the part that we are all most proud of, and I think what's had the most amount of campaigning in the past, is very much down the bottom. It's almost at the bottom with recovering and returning plastic back into the environment. Let's explore why we've got such a strong relationship with plastic. Call this plasticide, because what I started off thinking was perhaps one of our best materials on earth, turns out has a few hidden trumps. So plastic has 2 main ingredients: bisphenol A, known as BPA, and phthalate. So BPA is contained in plastic drink bottles, baby bottles, microwavable plastics, cans, and also till receipts. BPA is used to harden plastics and keep bacteria from contaminating foods, and also prevents cans from rusting. So just remember that point about BPA is in there to prevent food being contaminated from bacteria. The second ingredient, phthalate, it's basically what makes plastic plasticky, if you like. It's used as a plasticizer, so it's added to plastics to increase their flexibility, transparency, durability, and longevity. So our love affair with plastic: it's strong, it's light, it's durable, it's inert, it lasts forever, and we were told originally that there were no risks. Unfortunately, it's something of a terrible relationship. So it is obesogenic. Simply put, it makes you put on weight. It is also an endocrine disruptor. It has a gender-bending effect. I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. So it's very early days, but testing has pointed out that perhaps the use of plastics has impacted infants in that they will have hyperactivity and very poor development. It will cause obesity in small children. In ladies, it will lead to early puberty and breast cancer. And for men, apparently it will provide more testosterone. However, further testing and a little bit more research. First, to clarify, all males have a little bit of estrogen and all females have a little bit of testosterone, but it's balanced. So it's balanced in such a way so females remain female and men remain men. However, BPA increases testosterone in males. It's also a thyroid inhibitor, and it's your thyroid that actually controls your weight. So if your thyroid is inhibited, you will put on weight. So gentlemen, even though BPA has been highlighted to produce more testosterone, the problem is when you put on weight, your testosterone begins to convert into estrogen. Because BPA has more testosterone, you now have more testosterone to convert into estrogen. Ironically, the end result is the growth of breast tissue, commonly known as moods, loss of sex drive, erectile dysfunction, memory problems, attention deficit disorder, and even shrinkage of the male genitalia. Hence, BPA in short is known as a gender bender, and it actually mimics estrogen. It's actually a triple threat when you really think about it. So we drink a lot of carbonated drinks, which contain sugar, which automatically has been related to gaining weight. But these carbonated bottles, because they are single use, they are not BPA free. They contain all the BPA in the world, which means it's a thyroid inhibitor and it's going to help you gain weight. And if you're a male, that weight gain plus the extra testosterone, well, you're in trouble. So let's move on. I'm going to guess that perhaps this isn't the most positive of news, but it gets a little bit worse. So how deep is our obsession? Plastic has been found as in the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean, which is almost 11 kilometers deep. It's also been found as far as the Arctic in the most remote beaches in the world. So they tested the ecology out there, and krill, which is one of the smallest animals in the food chain in marine life, was found to have plastic. Mussels eat krill, and walruses, despite their size, pretty much only eat mussels and clams. So they eat up to 6,000 a day. They tested the walrus poo and discovered that they contain plastic as well. And they live as far out as the Arctic. Coral. So coral are the largest living structure on Earth, and they are only really perceptible to one disease on Earth, and it's called the Vibrio virus, and it's a strain of the cholera virus. And guess what? Plastics carry this virus, and they have now found that coral polluted with plastics have given coral the Vibrio virus. Remember what I said earlier on, the reason we put BPA into plastic is so that it doesn't cause bacteria in food, but ironically, it's obviously not working for the coral. Plastic people, so they did some testing in Norway in domestic wastewater treatment, and they took 10 samples from 8 wastewater treatment works, and every single sample was found to contain microplastics. But don't worry, guys, we have a great big bin in the middle of the ocean. This is the Great Pacific Park Garbage Pack, where everything is nicely collected for us. We could just get there, get it all up and recycle it. So according to psychologists, I think all of this news is bad news. So I couldn't get a cat video on here, but here are some plastic-free pictures of some very cute animals. Those are polar bears, some elephants, some fur seals. That is an Asian turtle. That is a baby hedgehog. And that is a seahorse. Unfortunately, reality bites. This is polar bears, and that is black plastic, which is notoriously difficult to recycle. These are Indian elephants in Asia foraging through plastic to get to their food sources. These are seals caught up in fishing gear. So I know in terms of plastic, only 1 million tons end up in the ocean, but it is some of the most robust and most virulent plastic that's out there, because fishing line is designed for strength. So once you're caught in it, there's pretty much no escaping. These are some Asian turtles caught up in fishing gear. And this is a hedgehog found in a Waitrose plastic bag. You can't quite see it. Just kind of going to demonstrate even the most responsible of us are still kind of guilty of plastic pleasures, if you like. And this is the most single most powerful image for me. It's a seahorse holding a cotton bud. And this is actually what made me go on my next venture, if you like. So all of this plastic, I thought I'd been doing well on, not using so much plastic. Also realized that the biggest influence in terms of plastic, most of the people who suffer happen to be in the south of the globe, particularly Asian countries, but they're also who are most influenced. Remember the fact about plastic bottles. So what we do in the West affects and seems to influence the south very, very much. So I wanted to see if I could travel for 5 days around the south without using plastic and see what impact I could have. So that's just to show you where Sri Lanka is, where I undertook my plastic pilot, if you like. And around 5 days, I did 5 locations, and that's the route I took. Apologies in advance for the videos, all I can say. Let me see if I can get these to play.
Hello from Fyrefly, environmental engineer and sustainability avenger here in beautiful Kandy in Sri Lanka, up here in the hill country. I'm here on a mission, 5 days, 5 simple rules around this beautiful island. Rule number 1, no plastic bottles. Rule number 2, no plastic bags. Rule number 3, no plastic cutlery. Rule number 4, no plastic cups. And rule number 5, no wet wipes. This is hard enough to do at home, but we're going to try and do this while we're travelling around an island where you can't drink the water out of the tap and everything is a takeaway culture. I'll keep you posted. Wish me luck.
It turns out, though, I had to take quite a lot of equipment to travel with. So I took 4 types of reusable plastic bottles, including one from the Institute of Water. And if you like, I ended up having to test all of them because I needed to carry 3 to 4 liters of water every day. It gets very, very hot in Sri Lanka. So I know you only need 2 liters of water here, but you end up drinking a lot more out there. As well as 2 sets of reusable cutlery. I had a traveling partner, so I thought I'd be prepared. Just as some testing goes, these roll-up little bottles with the carabiner turned out to be fabulous. These ones, the Brita bottles come with a small plastic filter a charcoal filter. So if I was in a place where I thought, okay, I've boiled the water, but I'm still a little bit worried, I could use the filter in the bottle. However, these bottles are not entirely what I call Mandhy proof. They do tend to leak all over the place every now and then. So moving on, day 1 was here. This is Kandy, and this is the sacred temple of the tooth. It's an ancient temple. It's holds Lord Buddha's tooth relic. It's to do with Buddhism. It's very sacred. It's very serene. That's the inside. It's also the only place when I left Colombo, which is the capital, that I found somewhere where they would provide a free water fountain with drinking water or water that you could drink without having to boil. Unfortunately, this is the inside of the temple. Despite the fact that they have provided clean water, pretty much even inside the temple, there's quite a lot of litter. Got a bit distressed, so I thought, you know what, I'm going to head over nearby to this place called Paranthan Botanical Garden. It's about 20 minutes by tuk-tuk, and it's one of the most beautiful gardens I've seen. It's just very peaceful, very pretty, lots of trees, giant bats there on the left-hand side, lots of monkeys. This is Sri Lanka after all. And this, it had the most clearly marked recycle bins I'd seen in the country. I looked at the recycle bins and I realized that I was going to be in a little bit of trouble with my rules. So on the left, you've got organics, the first green one. Next one, you've got a specific one called lunch sheets, and I'll explain what that is. Then you've got your plastic bottles for tin and glass. Then you've got plastic and polythene, and you've got paper. So lunch sheets. So by the way, Sri Lanka is amazing for wildlife and also food. This is called rice and curry. So it's Sri Lanka's most popular food. It's eaten for lunch, dinner, and sometimes breakfast. It's also the country's most popular takeaway food. It's very healthy. It's got 4 to 5 curries in it, meat and fish, and you normally traditionally eat it with your hands. Traditionally, it was wrapped in banana leaf. It was wrapped in banana leaf. It would keep it warm. It would stop it leaking everywhere, and then it would be wrapped in newspaper and sold in the shops. So as a traveler, it's a great kind of travel food. It's cheap, it's healthy, and it's sustainable. Modern times, Sri Lanka now wraps everything in this thing called a plastic lunch sheet. So instead of using a sustainable banana leaf, of which there are plenty of in Sri Lanka, the food is wrapped in a plastic lunch sheet, specially created for these lunch packets. And on the top right, you see the papadam, which is also wrapped in a lunch sheet. This is now what you buy from the shop. It's wrapped in plastic, then wrapped in newspaper, then put in a polythene bag. So as a traveler looking for something that was cheap, easy, healthy, sustainable, it pretty much took out the biggest meal I had been relying on throughout. So I was pretty much starving, by the way, this time. So headed out for dinner, and I'm going to give you a little analogy. If you want to get anything done, or if you want to confirm anything in Asia, you really need to repeat yourself at least 3 times. So every time I ordered a drink, I had to say, no straw, please, I don't want a straw. Also, Asians love to drink sugar. So the next part is, I really don't want any sugar. Just 1 sugar, ma'am. No sugar, no straw. So I was quite insistent, and my traveling companion did think that I was a little bit rude at times. You really don't need to insist quite so much. I'm like, I really do. And this is what happened when they ordered a drink. We ended up with, this is lime juice with sugar and 2 straws. So it was kind of this is only day 1. And I was like, did I fail? So it wasn't my drink. So I thought, okay, I've passed, but with straws attached. So for the rest of the drink, we realized how much more insistent we were going to have to be if we didn't want straws or sugar. So that was day 1. Going on to day 2, this is called the Plastic Perahera. So Perahera is a festival. It dates back to the 3rd century, and it is all to do with Buddhism. It's got a never-ending amount of elephants, lights, dancers, fire eaters, and it goes on for 10 days. It's got more than 5,000 performers, all of who are volunteers. They dance on the street every night for 3 hours. Just to show you, there is a dancer who's been offered a drink in a plastic cup. Just go back to it because it gets very, very hot. So imagine 5,000 dancers all being offered a drink along the way in a single-use plastic cup. This is just to take you back a few hours. These are the crowds sitting up waiting for the Perahera to start. Roughly 20,000 people attend this Perahera or parade every year. Most are locals and most are Buddhist pilgrims. So Buddhism has a concept called ping, and it's to build merit. You look after the poorer people by giving them food and drink. It's also to do with looking after the environment, ironically. However, if you see, Sri Lankans love their food, but that is everything wrapped in plastic bags. One of the reasons I love traveling in Sri Lanka is the snacks. So off I went to buy snacks, and unfortunately, to show you a few more pictures, these are some of the girl guides offering Tango in single-use plastic cups for people sitting down. Just see, they also provide free drinking water, and yet there is a plastic bottle there. If you can see, those are fried peanuts down the bottom. Absolutely delicious, but in plastic bags. Those are pineapples being sold, again in plastic bags. That is homemade popcorn sold in plastic bags. And yes, candy floss sold in plastic bags. I couldn't find even one snack along the route to buy that wasn't sold in a plastic bag. And ironically, Buddhism is about protecting the environment, but I wondered just how much plastic was created from this one event over the 10 days. But there were very many beautiful elephants. So plastic-free day 2, however, a little bit peckish throughout the day because I really couldn't buy anything on the street. So day 3, picture-perfect train journey from Kandy to Senewiratne. I was told this is one of the most beautiful train journeys in the world. I did get on the train and I have to say I agreed. This is what I looked at for 3 hours. It's basically rolling hills of rivers and tea country. What they didn't tell me was that I should have booked 6 months in advance. The train was absolutely packed. You can only have roughly 55 people in a carriage, but I stopped counting at 85. So for the whole 3 hours, I didn't get a seat. But it was very nice to see kind of the locals and foreigners all sitting together. Again, one of the best things about Sri Lanka is the food. This is a vendor selling his homemade wares. That is vada. It's kind of like a fried dal donut. It's delicious. This is guava, and that suspicious looking bottle holds vinegar, chili, and sugar. So we tend to eat a lot of the fruits raw with that marinade, if you like. Unfortunately, it's in a plastic bag, just like everything else that was sold on the train. So again, realize that this whole snacking thing whilst you're trying to be plastic free doesn't really work out for you. I should have taken my own snacks. And it did feel that everyone but me was buying this delicious guava on the train. So we went on to Kandy. Let me see if I can get to it. This is a protected water reservoir, if you like. Getting on here, we stayed here at the Senewiratne Hotel. They had a strawberry festival, and as you can see, everything was covered in plastic. Only the cakes weren't covered in plastic, so I decided I would just have strawberries and tea. And this is another video. So day 4, we went on to look at waterfalls. Absolutely beautiful waterfalls and tea estates. The only thing more beautiful than a waterfall or a tea estate is a waterfall in a tea estate. This is the entrance to St. Clair's Falls. It's one of the most famous waterfalls.
Down the path, and over here the local vendors are selling avocados and strawberries. Unfortunately, everything is in a plastic bag, and every tourist that comes along will buy one, as you should, to keep the economy in check. But this is what happens when everything is plastic.
We kept walking down and it's extremely polluted. Skip that one for there. And the final one is day 5. I went around Kandy earlier and I got to the beach. So this was supposed to be a chill out day. But on the way to the beach, I found this gentleman burning rubbish on the side of the street. So I wanted to ask him why or what was going on.
This is Gnanasiri, my friend that I met on the street, and he's just gonna explain why they're burning. I think Gnanasiri mata kiyanawada ai මේවා ඔක්කොම පුච්චන්නේ කියලා.
මේ කියන්නේ මේවා තිබුණම ඇවිල්ලා දඩ ගහනවා මේවා දැක්කම.
කවුද දඩ ගහන්නේ?
එනවා මේ පාදේශීය භාගයෙන් PHI මහත්තයා එමෙ ඇවිල්ලා මේවා දැක්කම මදුරෝ ඩෙන්ගු. ඒගොල්ලනුත් ඇවිල්ලා මේ උදව් කරනවා. ඒ වුණාට අනතුරු වීමක් කරන්නේ මේවා පරිසුදුව තියාගන්න කියලා.
ඔව්. ඒ වුණාට ඔයගොල්ලෝ ඇයි මේ ප්ලාස්ටික් උත් පුච්චන්නේ?
පුච්චන්නේ මේවා වල්ලම්මට දිරන්නේ නැහනේ.
දිරන්නේ නැහැ. ඒ වුණාට මේ ඇයි කොහේ හරි දාන්නේ රීසයික්ලින් හරි නැත්නම් නගර සභාව ගෙනියන්නේ නැත්තේ?
ගෙනියනවා. ඒ පල්ලෙහා පැත්ත ගෙනියනවා.
ඔව්.
ඒ ගෙනිච්චට මේවා මේ දාන්න තැනක් නැහැ මේ මිනිස්සුන්ට. මේවා පාරයි මේ පුච්චලා සුද්ධ කරනවා.
So that is basically, that was supposed to be my fun day of the trip, but I realized actually how bad the problem had got. So if you travel around Sri Lanka, almost all of the coastal cities have the same problem. Traditionally, people used to burn or bury their waste because you cannot leave it out because of mosquitoes. Now they're burning it, but it's infused with plastic with all those VOCs and toxic pollution. So when you walk by, you can barely breathe. So it's, I guess, a whole global view. Plastic is bad, but actually brings along with it a whole raft of problems. Just to finish off, I did manage to survive my 5 days without using any plastic bottles, any plastic bags, any plastic cutlery or straws or takeaway cups or wet wipes. But I did realize that I was going to have to do a lot more if I really wanted to convince people to not use plastic along the way. I think hopefully I finished just on time, Phil.
Just about. We'll go for on time. That's fine.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay. Thank you very much, Mandhy. Just going to go on to the next slide. Yeah, there we go. So we're going to hand over to Jonathan now. Jonathan is a chartered environmentalist via the Institution of Environmental Sciences and works within the Groundwater and Contaminated Land function of the Environment Agency. Now we're moving away from the plastic themes that are in the headlines at the moment, and we're going to delve into the construction industry. And Jonathan asks the question: construction, demolition and excavation waste, is the industry on the right track? And I'm going to pop back after Jonathan's talk for the questions that have been put to both Mandhy and Jonathan, and we'll go through those questions. So thank you very much for joining us, Jonathan. Hopefully you have control of the screen now.
Right, I want to just flip through the sort of wastes that come out of construction and demolition works. A lot of construction activity nowadays has got some fairly good practices in terms of taking buildings down and even in terms of sort of new materials that are brought to site, separating some of the offcuts and so on and so forth. And you go to a construction site and there might be some very good separated bins or different plasterboard or different bits of timber or different bits of plastic pipe. But unfortunately, a lot of construction waste comes out of the demolition and the excavation activities, and these aren't so well looked after. However, under the Waste Framework Directive, we do have a responsibility to move towards, in 2020, a 70% reduction of this sort of material going to landfill for disposal. So there is a pressure on the construction and demolition and excavation industry areas to actually try and do something else with their materials. But unless you handle it carefully, it becomes a bit of a mixed waste that is very, very difficult to get rid of. And if it's mixed up badly, then it can become all hazardous waste, and that's very expensive to get rid of, even for disposal to landfill. So in terms of assessing whether we've got material that is suitable for use, we do have a number of mechanisms. The clear definition of waste code of practice allows for source recovery in certain circumstances, but mirroring what's required in the Waste Framework Directive, that material must be suitable for the proposed use. It mustn't pose a risk to the environment, cause harm to human health, and it must replace the need to use virgin materials for the same activity. It should be covered by a best practice approach, so that's confirmed by a suitably qualified person with chartered status, and it assumes technical competence and integrity in all relevant parties. So there's also an Aggregates Protocol that we have under the waste industry that allows for the reuse of recycled aggregates, which we've just been talking about recycling as being sort of kind of down the bottom, but in terms of reusing hard materials coming from the construction and demolition industry, you know, it was seen that recycled aggregates would be a really good idea and prevent us needing to sort of dig huge quarries for virgin material. And indeed, that's the case. But for materials to be non-waste under the protocol, you have to produce them to a specific standard in a factory production control method. And too often, a lot of the material that's produced by the construction demolition industry is just basically crushed and screened, and it doesn't really conform with any construction product regulations or relevant British standards. It also sometimes has input materials that don't comply with the list under the protocol, and you end up with materials that really aren't suitable for reuse and certainly have not ceased to be waste materials under the protocol approach. So we're looking for better activities and better practice in the construction industry to cover that and make sure that materials are appropriate for reuse and are used appropriately under the relevant protocols or exemptions or codes of practice. The way to do that is to make sure that the materials are tracked from when they're excavated or taken out of a demolition activity on a building, and ensure that they're suitably moved around and segregated, and materials are actually tracked, and there are good quality records to go with that. In terms of soils, particularly materials that are excavated on many sites, the sites have had previous development on them, and the soils underneath the site might be a fairly mixed bag. You might have made ground that's previously been imported to make up the levels on the site for the previous construction. There might be materials that have seeped into the ground from the previous activity that have contaminated the underlying soils, and you might have soils that have been mixed up and not as they were naturally originally. Also, you have to take account of the fact that even moving what seems to be clean, naturally occurring soils, we have natural contaminants in our soils based on the underlying geology. And if those materials are placed in the wrong setting, even what appears to be clean, naturally occurring soils can actually end up causing pollution of the environment because materials leach from them. Particularly concern related to perhaps arsenic in some areas of the country, particularly down in the southwest where we have a base geology that has arsenopyrite in it. And if that material is moved and used inappropriately, then you can end up with arsenopyrite leaching into local surface waters and streams and so on. So we have to think very carefully about the quality of our soils that are being reused. And the question that developers should ask if they're importing soils to their site is, do you actually know what you're getting? Have your suppliers and hauliers and contractors actually got materials from proper sources? Are there proper records related to those sources? And is the final use on your site suitable for the material that you're importing? There's a lot of material that's described as soil product. Unfortunately, it's a fairly mixed bag in many cases. And if you're taking material from some of the soil manufacturing sites, you might be asking for topsoil and you end up with a very clay mix of material, which really isn't very suitable as a topsoil and quickly becomes waterlogged, and grass that's grown in it quickly dies off. Or you may end up with a mixed bag of material that seems to be nice soil, but actually it's got contaminants in it. And those can be physical contaminants in terms of bits of plastic, bits of pipe, bits of metal, bits of glass, or indeed they can be chemical contaminants that have come from screening and sorting of skip waste, and perhaps the soil fractions have been taken out, but that doesn't take out all the heavy metals contamination or the organic hydrocarbon contamination that might have been associated with some of the original material. So the question to always ask is, do you understand the material, and is any environmental risk being fully managed? And what quality is required if you're going to use best practice and therefore use materials that aren't designated as waste materials? So you need to think very carefully about where your soils come from. Did they come from a greenfield site that was excavating surplus materials? Or did they come from a waste transfer station that's been doing a bit of screening and has got soils fractions separated out, and they've been added to a bit of compost and called a topsoil product, even though they're probably still a waste? Or did they come from the fines that have been coming from a screening exercise where demolition rubble's been crunched and scrunched up? And then those fines mixed again with a compost type material or some sand to try and create some form of a soil forming material. Unfortunately, many of the crushing and demolition activities from old buildings particularly include cement asbestos fragments, and those get crushed up in the screening activity, and you end up with fibres in your soils. And there's been many instances where topsoils that have been brought from sites where they process various types of aggregate and soil material have actually been found by the environmental health officers to contain a fair bit of asbestos fibre. So where did your soil come from is a fairly critical question, just in terms of its environmental impact and its potential harm to human health impacts. However, there are other issues to be thought about, and obviously in terms of moving waste around, there are regulations that cover that. And just a quick survey of our waste crime a couple of 3 years ago, it showed the construction and demolition industry were responsible for 31% of waste crime, where the impacts from illegal storage, treatment, or dumping of wastes was that they weren't compliant with regulations, and that the activity was deemed to be a waste crime. And we've prosecuted a number of those cases over the past few years successfully. Doing some audits on waste transfer stations and how wastes were coming from construction sites. These are called Chapter 17. These are soils that come out of waste treatment sites. But very carefully, you have to think about how it's coded. If it's being screened and treated physically in any way through a soil manufacturing process, then actually you're not getting a clean soil that's a 1705 type soil. You might be getting a 1905 code, and that's very different. So it's only soils that can come under specific codes that will be deemed to be non-waste unless they're actually compliant with relevant protocols, as I talked about the Aggregates Protocol, which has to show a factory production process and a specific meeting of the British standard that's relevant, or the code of practice, like the definition of waste code of practice. So it's not just about looking at the soil and working out what it looks like. It's about finding out what its quality is and also where it's come from, not just immediate previous holder of the material, but also the records going back to how they got hold of that material themselves. So best practice is about knowing the soil material or the stone and aggregate material you're bringing in, but also about where its origins are. It's about keeping materials streams separate so that you don't end up with some asbestos fragments getting into your soils or your aggregates. It's about ensuring there's relevant testing to show that the soil is there. One of the big problems we have with test certificates, particularly on soil, is that you'll be given test certificates for soil from a stockpile, but you need to check that that actually represents the soil that you're actually getting. Many of the certificates provided are provided from maybe 6, 7, 12 months ago, and the material you're getting hasn't been recently sampled, so you're not actually sure that it meets a relevant standard or is appropriate to transfer as a non-waste from a soil manufacturing site, for instance. So using permitted sites and registered carriers gives you some level of comfort, but you need to have a fairly robust chain of evidence from those sites and carriers to make sure that your donor sites that are sending you material for reuse on the development site is actually a pucker certification and sampling process. Okay, so particularly focusing on secondary aggregates, it's a great idea and we very much support the production and recycling of secondary aggregates, but obviously they do need to go through the proper protocol. And following that protocol in full is how you reach an engineered standard of material that's suitable for reuse and reaches that all-important non-waste classification. And then it's a case of making sure that you use the specific materials in the specific way under a relevant development permission. The key thing about all of this, to make it more important, is that there were changes to the landfill tax regime back in April this year, and that new regulation makes an extension of the landfill tax under the Finance Act for materials deposited as waste in places other than permitted or licensed landfill sites. So previously, if you disposed of material at a landfill site, then that material was also subject, as well as the relevant fees for the receiving site, was also subject to a landfill tax. There's two levels of landfill tax. There's the lower base tax, which is for totally inert materials, and then there's a higher rate tax. Now, we were finding an awful lot of people didn't want to pay that tax, so they were finding different ways and means to dispose of that material in illegal places. And because those places weren't permitted, then following up the tax route was becoming increasingly difficult. So the change was made to the Finance Act to allow, if we deem materials to have deposited illegally, then irrespective of the issues under the environmental regulations related to depositing material at a site that's not a permitted site, we could also pass that material, that information across to HMRC, and they could then require relevant landfill tax to be paid. Now, I say relevant landfill tax because it's really important that we understand what that might be, and we'll come on to the details of it in a minute. But we do have still some safeguards, so you can deposit materials at a site that's not a disposal facility, providing that you do it under the relevant positions, protocols, or codes of practice. So, in other words, if you carry out an activity, it won't be taxed, providing it meets the relevant protocols or codes of practice that don't require you to have an environmental permit, or if you are depositing it at something like a recovery site that has an environmental permit, then again, the landfill tax won't be payable. But you have to have full regard to the relevant guidance that's provided around these exemptions or position statements, and it's only materials that fully comply with these position statements or protocols that would be exempt from the landfill tax implications. So you need to check the current status of any guidance that you're using and make sure that you're using it fully if you're trying to benefit from either an exemption, a regulatory position statement for something like topsoil, the definition of waste code of practice for soils, or indeed the aggregates protocol for aggregates. If you don't, you have to potentially end up with a position where a deposit might be made that might be subject to landfill tax. And the persons responsible for those are what's called a joint and several liability. So if you're sending materials out, or if you're hauling materials, or if you're taking materials onto your site, if you don't know their full provenance, as it were, then potentially you could be liable for some landfill tax if we determine that that material has been deposited illegally, or it doesn't meet any of the relevant protocols, codes of practice, or exemptions. This changes the ball game quite significantly for landowners and for hauliers and for developers who are moving these types of materials around. And your only real defense against an HMRC claim would be that if you have had a very robust due diligence. And the sorts of things we're talking about there is that you have records of all the material from where it originated from and where it passed through a different hub site or tracking site or permitted site, the trace waste transfer station, for instance. You know that the hauliers have been registered hauliers, and in some cases that you've got actually sort of tracking mechanisms to show that you know exactly where your materials have gone off site or where your materials have come from. So that joint several liability is quite a significant new stick to be using in terms of looking at waste management. So as I've said, just because materials come from a permitted site doesn't necessarily mean that they've met an end of waste position. If you're taking secondary aggregates in, that you do need to have made sure that you've checked the records of the site that's produced those to make sure that they're fully compliant with the Aggregates Protocol. And that includes things like they've got to have training records for the staff that are operating the kit. The kit itself has got to be maintained in accordance with manufacturers' recommendations. The sampling protocols have got to show that the input materials were only those allowed under the protocol, and that the outputs comply with the British standards for that type of material. For soil manufacturing sites, again, those that have not met a formal end of waste agreement with us, or they've reached an end of waste test providing evidence to that effect, or they're compliant with the topsoil RPS, then it may well be that they are making soils, but that material might still be a waste material. So if you take it onto your site, you might end up with an illegal deposit of waste. Construction and demolition sites that are producing surplus material and simply passing it on down the road or transferring it between sites without using relevant protocols, or something like the definition of waste code of practice for soils reuse, could well be exchanging waste materials. And if those sites are found to be non-compliant, then you could end up with an illegal waste deposit that might be subject to landfill tax. So be very careful about where you get materials and how you move them around. So the conclusion is you need to move, we all want to move towards a reduction in construction and demolition waste that's going to landfill, and the relevant changes to exemptions for certain reuse activities and the protocols and the codes of practice that we've developed with industry help us to understand and use better practice so that we all have competence in recovered materials. And it also avoids poor quality materials being misplaced or illegally dumped, which then pose a risk to the environment or risk to human health. And certainly in terms of illegal dumping can impact amenity and damage ecological habitats, all of which we'd like to avoid. So sites which recover materials for reuse within the construction and landscaping industries really need to understand all the permitting arrangements and all the best practice mechanisms, and use the right people that are properly registered, because otherwise moving materials around can mean that you're potentially handling a waste that is not in its appropriate place. And if you are taking responsibility for materials that haven't got proper exemptions or protocol status, then it may well be that you're not just subject to waste regulations and the potential fines associated with taking illegal waste or depositing waste illegally at a site that hasn't got a permit. From April this year, you may well be subject to additional landfill tax. And the landfill tax penalties for materials that are deemed to have been deposited illegally are the higher rate landfill tax bracket and 100% plus for a sort of penalty fine, and they can also, people involved with that activity can also be subject to further criminal prosecution under the tax regimes. So it's a fairly significant difference to the sorts of fines that we might get through the courts for an environmental misdemeanor. And it's been quoted, one case we had recently, that maybe you might get a fine that's worth £70,000 for an illegal deposit activity under the environmental regulations. That same quantity of material that was involved could be subject to a landfill tax bill of over 6 million. So significant changes and significant new things for people to be aware of. And as I said, the key thing about the landfill tax side of things is that it is a joint and several liability. So folk need to have a real regard to how they're managing materials, either leaving their sites as construction and demolition or excavation wastes, or indeed coming onto their sites from either other construction sites, other demolition sites, or waste transfer stations, or soil manufacturing sites in particular. We all have to have regard to the quality. We all have to have regard to the mechanisms that we enable us to reuse, which we want to encourage where possible. But it comes down to a very clear assessment of suitability for use and specific site settings in relation to the type materials that we're actually using, and to ensure that they don't pose a risk to the environment and they don't pose a risk to harm to human health. It's quite a complicated business, waste regulations, and particularly in the construction industry. In the past, it hasn't been done that well. The HMRC guys that are working in the new team related to these tax changes are following up on the first tranche of 40-odd illegal deposit sites. And so I expect there will be some news on those towards the end of this year, where people might be getting a rather big bill. And I would encourage everybody who's on the construction and engineering side of things to have a good word with their accountants about their financial risk registers, because getting waste management wrong could now add a significant bill to your project if you don't get it sorted out. Okay, I know I've rattled through that fairly quickly. Hopefully we've caught up on a bit of time, but I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any questions along those ideas.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Jonathan. And thank you for your talk earlier, Mandhy, as well. Some very different insights into waste, which is an ongoing problem in modern life. So we do have some questions coming in. We've had some questions throughout the webinar. So whilst they're coming in, we have had some questions prior to the webinar starting, which was via the registration process. But a question from me actually to start off with, and it's aimed at Jonathan, looking at the possible environmental impacts of construction, demolition, and excavation waste. So what are if it's not dealt with incorrectly, what are maybe the two main environmental problems that could cause?
Well, it all comes down to exactly what the material is. So obviously, just if you have a stockpile of material that, for concrete crush from a demolition, for instance, you can get an issue of dust that's blowing that material off site in dry conditions, windy conditions. But unfortunately, a lot of that material, because of the nature of asbestos use back in buildings right up until the end of the 1990s, actually, there could be asbestos fibers, which you can't actually see, but which pose a significant health risk. So if you've got dust arising from a stockpile of crush on a development site that's adjacent to other residential areas or business use areas, there could be quite a significant risk just from that dust, not just from the actual particulates themselves, but also perhaps in trained fibers and things like that. So yeah, there is a risk related to the misuse of material or the mishandling of the material. From construction sites. Right.
Now, asbestos is something that's fallen off the media wagon really over the last few years, that's for sure.
Indeed, and it's becoming found quite ubiquitous, but I mean there's quite a lot of work going on asbestos at the moment. Okay. And there'll be more on that in due course.
Right. So another question here. This is from the registration process. There was an option to ask a question. So this one's from there. This is for Mandhy, really, but we may get Jonathan's input as well. So the question is, as a consumer, going plastic-free costs me more money. So how can you convince me that it's worth paying the extra?
If there's a bit more information on that, that would be good. Basically, I know it feels like it's costing you more, but if you bought one bag and you kept reusing it, hopefully you don't have to keep buying another bag. Anything from bags to cups. You know, coffee cup is my favorite example. You get your 50p back. So even if you bought a more expensive reusable coffee cup, let's say it costs you £10 or even 15, that's 30 coffees later, you've made it back. In terms of cost, you can look at financial costs, and you can also kind of look at environmental costs. At some point, we're going to have to start to pay for the cleanups. If there's more plastic out there, the money is going to come out of the public pocket to clean up for it. So kind of look at it a whole life cost. I guess it's a different financial balance.
Okay, well, hopefully that helps. I am conscious of time. However, we're going to continuously rattle through some questions, if that's okay with you too.
Yep.
And then if you're able to continue to listen, then that's fantastic. So we'll continue with some more. Now this one again is potentially for Mandhy. Thinking about the plastic tour, or the plastic-free tour, was there much surprise to Mandhy asking for no plastic amongst the Sri Lankan people and vendors? So was there an element of surprise that you got back when you asked for no straws, for example?
Very much so. I guess I rattled through some of that. Asia, especially Sri Lanka and India and Pakistan, they are obsessed with plastic. When you say no bag, they say what? You say no bag, thank you. What? Like, no bag, I don't want a straw. It's a completely alien concept. So that picture of me with the lime juice drink, you won't believe it, but I'd already had 2 lime juices when my colleague ordered his 3rd one, despite me saying no straw, because he didn't specifically say no straw. His drink ended up with 2 straws. Okay,
and just to confirm, that's not a language barrier thing, is it? Because you speak the language, right?
I do, and most Sri Lankan vendors will speak at least a little bit of English. So things like bags and straws, which traditionally tourists especially have insisted on, they get that part. So it's just culture change required.
Culture change, education, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, a question. This is definitely for Jonathan, and I think you briefly mentioned it in your talk, but maybe a bit of an elaboration on this. Why does the regulator for CDE, which I assume is construction, demolition, and excavation, so why does the regulator for CDE waste not have a soils protocol in place to assist waste producers and waste professionals?
Well, there is a soils protocol. So there's this was developed originally actually from some work we did on Channel Tunnel Rail Link, or High Speed 1 as it's now known. And then that was taken forward in the Environment Agency materials reuse on greenfield and brownfield sites. As we changed the way that we operated in terms of producing guidance, the government was very much keen that the Environment Agency produces guidance on regulations alone, and in terms of the technical guidance on reuse of soils type materials, that was done by industry. That's across the board now, that technical guidance is produced by the relevant industry. And so that's how it's done now, and that's why the CLARE definition of waste code of practice is the protocol for how you might be able to reuse soils in specific circumstances. So there is one, but it's you need to look on the CLARE website, clare.co.uk website, and find the definition of waste code of practice, which is the technical guidance document for how you can reuse soils materials.
So there's a useful tip for everyone. Now, this is probably maybe for both of you actually. We're going to go for Mandhy first, but is returnable packaging the way forward?
I'm not sure, unless it's returnable and reusable. I know on construction sites, we often used to send the packaging straight back to the supplier, but I guess if they could return it, and if we knew it was going to be reused, I know that, and I don't know how true this is, I'm going to try this myself and maybe come back and post something on it. I know that apparently you're able to post your plastic packaging back to certain supermarkets. So this is something that I was like, how? I've not seen anything publicly written out about it, but people are like, you could just pack everything and post it back. So I will come back to you on it. I think the answer is less packaging to begin with. Most things that come packaged, I mean, I don't know why we need to package things like bananas. They already have a hardy enough skin, in terms of food and a lot of kind of cosmetic products, they are over packaged, so less packaging to begin with. And yeah, maybe returning is step 2.
Okay. And Jonathan, as Mandhy briefly said there, in terms of construction and so on, there is a return element to some materials that come onto site. Is that correct?
There are, in terms of some materials, if they're ordered in surplus, but actually a lot of construction sites just order materials in as need on the day, and you get a lot of materials that are deposited and brought to site. Most of the sort of packaging waste is associated with pallets or steel straps or plastic straps that hold the materials in place as they're being delivered to site. You do get some materials that are sort of plastic wrapped, but those are the sorts of materials which, generally speaking, do actually go into the sort of relevant waste bins on the construction site. And obviously any of the metals and timber from pallets and so on and so forth does tend to go back through the recycling route. The plastic film and wrap perhaps is a little bit more difficult, but some of that is going off to waste to energy type activity. But some of it, a lot of it does still go to landfill, unfortunately. But it's not so much the waste, the materials that are brought in packaging that poses the biggest concern. It's the materials that are sort of out of the excavation and demolition activities that are the biggest problem areas often.
And this is a similar, or a follow-up question really. So it starts off with a statement. It is estimated a third of waste leaving a construction site is packaging. How do we reduce this? I guess you've mentioned it a couple of times just then. Maybe another question is, what do you think could be done more in terms of reducing that construction packaging?
Well, again, it comes down to sort of why do we package things? And, you know, in many cases you might say, well, why is a load of bricks packaged with plastic? It's the same sort of story as the banana, really. Why add additional packaging if you don't need to? So I think, you know, there is still an element of learning in that industry to actually cut down on the amount of packaging or wrapping or delivery mechanisms that are needed, and try and sort of safeguard how much we have to then deal with as a waste material afterwards. But it comes back to, you know, the whole life cycle thing again, and what things are put in place for. A lot of it is just purely sort of convenience, as we've seen with Mandhy's stories about, you know, snack packaging and so on and so forth. It's become easier and more convenient just to wrap everything in plastic, put it in plastic. You know, we used to buy fish and chips in paper. Nowadays, it's all wrapped in paper, possibly recycled paper potentially rather than newspaper, but it's always then put in a plastic bag, isn't it?
Yes.
So, you know, maybe we need to go back to sort of looking at why we wrap things. Do we need to wrap things? Do we need to have, particularly on construction sites, the amount of packaging and wrapping that we do have, and what kind of material should it be? It's easier to perhaps recycle metal straps than it is for plastic straps, but you know, that comes back to costs as well. But it's looking at that whole life cycle that's important, not just looking at elements of it in a very sort of individual way, I think is the story.
I'm quite pleased that my local fish and chip shop, they don't offer plastic bags anymore. So that's a good one for my local area. There you go. Again, on the construction and demolition side of things, it starts off with a thank you, Jonathan. So that's very nice. What are the preferred options for utilising construction and demolition waste on site where it comes from? Being used as a material, or should it be as waste?
Yeah, I mean, this depends on the type of material. Obviously, if you're sort of knocking a building down on a site, then you have a sort of construction demolition activity. That material can be properly either reprocessed on site under a factory production type protocol, or it can be sent off site to a site that can do that in a proper way, and then that material can be reused as secondary aggregates. In terms of soils, you can reuse soils on site depending on what that soil material is. Or again, it can go off-site to alternative sites, and the definition of waste code of practice allows people to reuse soils on other sites, either directly, fairly straightforwardly, if it's a clean, naturally occurring soil that's been dug up on a greenfield site, or if it's a brownfield soil that needs some level of pre-treatment before it can be reused somewhere else, then that either can go through a temporary treatment activity under a mobile treatment permit on another site, and be used on that site, or it can go through a hub site that's been agreed and formally agreed with the Environment Agency for that specific material for that specific time. So yeah, we very much encourage the reuse of materials of construction, demolition waste and excavation waste on sites. Where it can be reused on site, there are mechanisms that can be done. And where it can go off-site to other reuse on other development sites, that can be done. But it just needs to be following the right protocols or the right codes of practice to enable that to happen without the waste banner being a problem.
Okay.
I hope that answers that one.
Yes, yes. Now this isn't a question, but Mandhy, you're inspiring people, so I thought I should let you know. Somebody is off to Thailand for 3 weeks across the Christmas and New Year period, and you have inspired them to be more prepared, more in advance, and to enable them to reduce their plastic waste and consumption. So,
excellent. My work here is done.
one person at a time. Excellent. And there's another question here somewhere that I was lining up. Do you think the UK government should implement one waste and recycling system across the UK? I assume that that's household waste, but I'm not sure. Otherwise, that could be quite tricky because it's quite a broad waste spectrum across the UK, I would assume.
I think, I mean, you know, it is very difficult to have a one-size-fits-all in anything, really. There's no sort of silver bullet answer to any of these problems that we have. And a lot of it is about, you know, everybody taking their own responsibility, whether it's chucking crisp packets down on the ground or else sending them in the mail appropriately back to the crisp manufacturer, or whether it's the reuse of, you know, recovering, putting things in different bins, and whether that works for a particular area. You know, we all have local government costs. We pay our taxes as a result of those. Council taxes go up all the time. Councils are under pressure because of cutbacks, and they need to have the most cost-effective recycling system they can across their borough. That's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all in every single part of the country, because it depends, you know, where the nearest plastics recycling place might be. There are some plastics that are easy to recycle, and there's lots of places around the country that can do that. There's other places that to get different types of plastic into recycled and reused means that material has to travel a fair distance to the recycler, and that doesn't always work in terms of cost of transport, because plastics can be, you know, fairly bulky material, but they're fairly light. So you're moving a lot of material on a lot of different lorries, and then we have other environmental impacts associated with that. So if councils are going to implement one waste system across the whole UK, that may not be the most sustainable option. I don't know if Mandhy's got any other comments.
I've had a bit of clarification from the person who asked the question, and they said they were referring to things like bin colours, signage, certain items being able to be recycled and some not in various different areas, and that kind of thing. So I don't know if Mandhy, yes, if you had any input on that one.
I do. I agree with Jonathan in part, but to be honest, I mean, Germany does it, and I've looked at people who've kind of done it and got it right. It is, I mean, I agree, the cost of transport, but to be honest, if you can produce enough centres that's going to produce your plastics and your packaging, I don't see why we can't produce enough centres to recycle it, because our option is it's too complicated and too expensive to deal with. Well, we should have probably thought of that to begin with, and it is very good. But just the home recycling centre, I think I feel like I've read everything there is to know about plastic, and even then, you know, cling film isn't recyclable. I knew that some time ago, but I've lived with several housemates. I've spent half an hour going, right, guys, let's talk about our rubbish bins. Do you know what we can and can't put in? And these guys all work in the industry, so it is very confusing. And I think it would help to clarify, but we know recycling isn't the answer, but clarification would certainly help the cause.
Okay.
Yep, I think I agree. I think if we could make it all more singularly straightforward, then that would be a big plus.
Excellent. So I have just I'm going to use this as the last question. So sorry if I haven't reached your question, and we have quite a few in there. If you do have further questions and you want to get an answer for those, then please do email me with the details provided, and we'll try and get Mandhy and Jonathan to answer those for you. So the last question is aimed at Jonathan, really, and it's around the construction of brownfield and greenfield sites. I'm going to reword this slightly. Is the need to go to build on greenfield sites, is that partly because of the waste that you have to deal with from brownfield sites, as in the potential of contaminated land and so on, is it an easier option to go for the greenfield site? Would that be one of the main reasons behind going greenfield rather than brownfield? Maybe a complex question.
It can be, but it depends. Again, it depends on the locality and what the costs are for other issues associated with greenfield sites. You know, for brownfield sites, they're often in existing town centres and so on and so forth, and therefore your overall environmental impact of building new roads or new mechanisms for people to get to and from workplaces and transport hubs or whatever is much less than it is on a greenfield site. So there are different costs associated with things. A lot of greenfield sites also still have an awful lot of construction soil to get rid of, because they're digging foundations, they're digging trenches, they're digging road bases, etc., etc. And as I say, that material can be appropriately reused in other scenarios if the circumstances are right and the soil is right.
Okay.
We did have a very successful policy, sort of 15, 20 years ago, where 60% of new housing had to be built on brownfield sites. That was a mechanism, to sort of keep areas in towns that have become derelict re-energized, and that's been a huge benefit. But also it meant that those industrial sites were cleaned up. So, you know, there was a double benefit to that policy. But and that's coming back in again now under the sort of brownfield registers to some degree. But perhaps not quite the same degree as that 60% policy housing. Yeah.
Okay.
But it is working back towards that. But they're different beasts and they have different issues. So there's not necessarily one is better than the other in every situation.
Okay. Right. That brings us to the end of the questions. So thank you very much for the answers that you provided there, and thank you very much for the time that you spent preparing and providing those talks for us. It's very much appreciated. Just going to go through a few things now, which is the upcoming webinars within this waste reduction series of webinars. So there are 3 of them, as mentioned before. So the next one is on the 21st of November, and that includes speakers such as Caroline Salthouse there and Martin Ballard, mainly around plastics in the aquatic and marine environment. And then Martin is discussing the broader plastic problem and how we can pledge to use less plastic. And then the one that follows that is exactly 6 months on from World Environment Day on the 5th of December, and that we have speakers there from Suez Recycling and from the Canary Wharf group, so Adam Reed and Martin Gettings. So please feel free to register for that one as well. So that brings us to the end of that webinar series. And then we also have upcoming series of webinars. So the one to follow this series will be the Innovations series. I feel like I've said series far too many times now, which comes up in the early stages of 2019. And then after that will be a Sustainable Built Environment series of webinars in mid-2019. And we're currently looking for speakers. So if you are interested in giving your insight into either of those different areas. Now, innovations is obviously very broad. Built environment, we're looking at the built environment itself, but still challenges from various different disciplines, and we want to hear your insights. So please do get in touch if you're interested in speaking in these webinars. That'd be fantastic. If you're interested in more information about the Chartered Environmentalist or Registered Environmental Technician registrations, then please head to our website. There are already some recordings of webinars we've done previously about how to become a registrant and why to become a registrant. That's from Chartered Environmentalists and Registered Environmental Technicians themselves. So quite good webinars to have a look into. And that brings us to an end. So thank you very much for listening and for taking part, and we shall see you at the next webinar.